Sounds like Europe. Cross-border podcasting.
Hello and welcome to Sounds Like Europe, Cross-Border Podcasting, a project brought to you by WePod. I am your host, Javi Caminero. Since this podcast and the WePod project were born, we have been saying that our documentaries will be available in the languages of the production companies involved and also in English. A very important part of the WePod project is its desire to bring our stories to the widest possible audience. And in order to reach more markets and make our stories easily heard and understood around the world, we felt it was necessary to translate our podcast into English. At the end of the day, between the partners of the WePod project, we constantly communicate in English. And the WePod project podcast, this one you're listening to, is in English for the very same reason. Europod, WePod's Belgian partner, is in charge of adapting all our stories into English. To get an in-depth look at how they do it, today I'm joined by Alex Ricci, coordinator of all the productions in WePod and Chief Operating Officer of Europod. Hi Alex, how are you?
Hi Javi, I'm good, thanks for having me.
It's becoming kind of a tradition talking to you at Sounds Like Europe every 2 to 3 months. So how are you doing? Are you as busy as usual?
Yes, we are busy as usual, but we're delivering on WePod commitments. So yeah, it's a very busy period, but we are also publishing a lot of podcast series, which is what we love to do. So it's good.
Yes, kind of everything has come into play, and now we're just releasing podcasts left, right, and center, and that's what it was all about. So I'm really happy that you're still here to tell us how everything is going. Before getting into the subject of the English remakes of the WePod documentaries, the ones that have already been done and they, as we speak, are being released, I would like to know something. What are the main goals behind this decision of translating this podcast into English? And do you think these goals are being fulfilled so far?
Well, yeah, the goal is obviously to make sure that the co-productions we are producing reach a global audience, an international audience. And this is the main reason why we decided to have part of this project a strand which foresees the remake of original language productions into English. So in this sense, it's a very important goal of WePod, and in this sense we are achieving because we already released one English language remake, which is called Sea of Rage, which is a remake of the Spanish podcast and Italian podcast we produced along the first year of WePod. Maybe we're going to talk about that, I don't know. But so yes, we're achieving.
You have already worked, as you said, on Mar de Rabia, Mare di Rabia, which is Sea of Rage, the English adaptation, and also you have been working with truck drivers. How was the process of adapting each podcast to English?
Well, the process obviously starts always from the original versions, right? So in the case of Sea of Rage, which is the remake, as you said, of Mar de Rabia and Mare di Rabbia, we started from the two original language podcast series. That was a peculiar challenge because the two series are not identical. So what we did is we tried to understand which of the two series which both deal with drug trafficking and narco trafficking, actually to some extent, was, in our opinion, easier to grasp for international audience. And so we decided to start from the Spanish version, which in our opinion has a leaner story, an easier story to grasp, if I may, with characters which are less heavy. And then we basically followed a bit the scheme which is also happening in the original language versions with a jump to the other country. Only that in this case, in the English language remake, the shift we make to Italy at a certain point within the series is longer than in what happens in the original Spanish version. And so, yeah, our decision was driven by the fact that the Spanish version is a bit more focused on narco trafficking, whereas the Italian version, for those who have listened, they already know, but it's pretty much focused also on the 'Ndrangheta, which is a very strong Italian mafia in Calabria. And we thought that, well, having a podcast about 'Ndrangheta was a bit more difficult for international audience unless we would have translated the full Italian podcast series only.
Mhm. It's not easy, as you are saying, to make the stories appealing to mass audiences, especially if they touch on subjects that are linked with specific places. With Sea of Rage, as you have been just saying, this happens because on Mar de Rabia we focused on Barbate, then we traveled to Gioia Tauro. Gioia Tauro has its very special and unique context with Ndrangheta. So what have you tried to highlight when preparing this English remake?
Well, there's two main things which we focused on. One was to simplify the Spanish version. So to give you a really concrete example, we have kept out of the English remake some really Spanish history-related specific things, like explaining the history of the name of a neighborhood or giving really historical details which for an international audience might be interesting but not necessarily relevant in the context of a podcast which is focusing on drug trafficking, right? And this was one thing we did on the Spanish version. And then when it came to inserting the Italian episodes, so the 2 episodes about Italy and drug trafficking happening across Italy and through Italy into Europe, so in Gioia Tauro, in the port town of Calabria, what we did there, we tried to take as much as possible the parts of the Italian podcast series which were really focused on narco trafficking, and we would explain the story of the 'Ndrangheta, but always with this objective in mind to link everything to drug trafficking. And these were the 2 main axes conceptually along which we worked to produce a remake which would be easy to understand for an international audience.
Talking now about the other English remake you have been releasing in this WePod project context, which is Truck Drivers. The final episode of this English version will be published on March the 13th. On that documentary, there are characters like Basilio who have a lot of presence on the series. So how do you approach the English remake without making these characters lose their strength?
Well, if I may, on this specific project, which is in original languages called Camioneros in Spanish and Vida Routier in French, and which has characters from both countries, in more specifically in the French version, the remake is mostly based on the French version.
Okay.
However, the characters of the Spanish version also entered the French version, so it means that the Spanish characters also will enter the English version. And but the remake of this project is easier because we take the French version, which is already much more international in kind, I believe, compared to the Spanish one, as our lead reference.
I believe, and I want you to confirm if this is the case, that with you being part of the production process of all these podcasts, the original versions, that must have made everything easier when it has come to preparing an English remake. So what did you put into these remakes that you had learned before during the whole year of working on these stories?
Yeah, I think you're right. Most of all, for us, it meant that things could go much faster. There was no need to familiarize with the original podcast series. And so this made things from the outset much easier, because I already know what was in every episode of all the series. And this made a huge difference for us to be able to process the remake within, 1/2 months, actually, all things comprehended. And then also, obviously, I put my English language voice at disposal for the English version in terms of hosting. And it helped me also to, when you coordinate the original productions, it helps you also to bring in maybe a bit more of a personal touch, and you can say that. And this also helps to give maybe to the English version a bit more that human touch, which otherwise is a bit more difficult to put into, I think, in terms of hosting and narration. And so I think these are the 2 main things that were a consequence of the fact that I was part of the original language co-productions.
Yeah, it's important for people to know that you were no outsider hosting and narrating the English version. You were part of all the meetings, of everything we were discussing throughout the whole process, so that was very helpful. There are more English remakes, of course, on the way, and they will be released gradually after each WePod documentary. What have you learned so far with Sea of Rage and Truck Drivers, and how do you intend to apply it to the next ones?
So first of all, I think that it works well. What I mean by that is that the outcome, I think, works in terms of listenability.
Mm-hmm.
And the second thing we learned is the role AI can play in all of this. And what I mean by that is that the dubbings we did for the podcast series, for the remake into English, are made through generative AI technology.
Mm-hmm.
And this was something new for us. We used AI based on the scripts, so based on the transcriptions of the extracts in original language. And I must say it's amazing how good this technology has become, and it makes things much easier to do in several languages. So, the role of AI can play in all of this. That's something we learned.
Mm-hmm.
And then also we had obviously a doubt, but it's an experimental project. Will the English versions actually work in terms of, listenability and, And I believe that the results are very okay, maybe also more than okay, but this is for the audience to judge, of course.
Well, let them judge. But as for me, I have been listening to Sea of Rage and also to Truck Drivers, and I can say for sure that the good work is obviously listenable when you turn on those episodes. Before we end this chat, Alex, I would like to ask you these couple of questions. These are now the classic Sounds Like Europe questions about your listening habits. You already know about this.
Right.
Last time you were here, when I asked you about your favorite podcast, at that moment, it was when you were talking with me and with Gloria Beltrami from Cora Media to present the podcast academy. You said the top spot for you was Kill List. Has it changed a couple of months removed from that interview?
I think it is an amazing podcast that was released, in 2024. So I will stick to that, but I also would like to give maybe some new, references.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's something really interesting which was done is Question Everything, which is a podcast which looks critically into the work of journalism. And that's something, a new podcast maybe to suggest to the audience. It's called Question Everything. It's an American production again.
Mm-hmm.
But that one.
Okay, everyone can find the link of this podcast on the description of this episode. So let's give it a try and see and listen how it falls on. And when I asked you last time, when was your favorite moment to listen to podcasts? Actually, the 2 times you have been here, you said that you love listening podcasts while cooking and running. Like, those are your moments. So I wanted to give this question a little twist so everyone can get to know Alex a bit better. Alex, what did you cook the last time you prepared a meal while listening to a good podcast?
Wow, I don't know. It must have been pasta, right? I mean, so I would say pasta.
Alex Ricci from Europod, coordinator of the productions of the WePod project. Thank you for joining me in this episode of Sounds Like Europe. It's been a pleasure talking to you once again.
Thank you, Javi. It was a pleasure.
And to everyone listening to this interview, I've been your host, Javi Caminero. Please stay tuned to the English versions of all the documentaries and stories we are releasing in the WePod project, because I truly believe they are a very good example of how a story can be adapted to multiple contexts. I will be back in 2 weeks with a new episode of Sounds Like Europe. Bye-bye.
Sounds Like Europe, Cross-Border Podcasting is a WePod podcast funded by the Creative Europe programme. Hosted and written by Javi Caminero, sound design by Manu Tomillo, coordinator Alexander Damiano Ricci, executive producer Anna Ribera.